Okay, let's kick things off with a quote. India is the pivot of our empire. If the empire loses any other part of its dominion, we can survive, but if we lose India, the sun of our empire will have set. Just let those words sink in for a second. That was the Viceroy of British India speaking way back in 1894. And I wanted to start right here because it perfectly sets up the absolutely staggering economic stakes we're talking about today. India wasn't just some random territory on a map. It was literally the economic engine of the largest empire on Earth.
Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving deep into a really fascinating chapter of history. We're going to conduct what is basically an economic autopsy of India right on the eve of its independence in 1947. You see, to truly wrap our heads around the structure of the modern Indian economy, we can't just look at the present day. We have to rewind and examine this foundational chapter. We need to look at exactly what shape the economy was in when nearly 2 centuries of British colonial rule finally ended. So we're going to check the vital signs of this massive nation to understand the real nature of that colonial economic relationship.
All right, here's our visual roadmap for today's explainer. 1. Pre-colonial prosperity. 2. Stagnation in agriculture. 3. Systematic industrial decline. 4. Foreign trade and wealth drain. And 5. Demographics and infrastructure. Okay, let's jump right into Section 1. Pre-colonial economic prosperity, the baseline.
To really grasp the decline, we first have to establish what the baseline was. Before the British arrived, India actually had a highly independent and prosperous economy. Sure, it was mostly agrarian, but it was also world-renowned for its incredibly fine manufacturing. Take Dhaka muslin, for example. This was a cotton textile from Bengal that was so exquisitely fine they literally called it Malmal Shahi, which means it was fit for royalty. It had this massive global market, but under colonial rule, that entire dynamic flipped. The whole point of British policy was essentially to reduce India into a subservient supplier of raw materials and then use it as a captive consumer market for Britain's own finished industrial goods. And the result of that shift? Well, during the first half of the 20th century, India's aggregate real output grew at a miserable rate of less than 2% a year, and per capita growth, a tiny 0.5%. Moving on to Section 2, Stagnation in Agriculture, a Dying Sector.
So, on the eve of independence, a staggering 85% of India's population got their livelihood from agriculture. 85%. But this massive, absolutely crucial sector was essentially dying. And a huge chunk of the blame for that falls squarely on the land settlement systems the colonial government brought in. The most famous one being the zamindari system, which hit the Bengal presidency really hard. Under this setup, the profits from the farming didn't actually go to the cultivators doing the back-breaking work. No. They went straight to the zamindars, the landlords. And the real tragedy here is that these landlords did basically nothing to improve the farms. Their only goal was collecting rent, completely ignoring how miserable the farmers' living conditions were. The colonial government gave these zamindars strict, hard deadlines to pay up the revenue, and if they missed a date, they'd lose their land rights. So as you can imagine, the zamindars just relentlessly squeezed the farmers to make sure they got their money.
Because of all this, the reality on the ground was just incredibly grim. We're talking about extremely low levels of technology, almost no irrigation, and a sector that was completely starved of any investment in basic necessities like terracing or flood control. The use of fertilizers was basically non-existent. And on top of that, a lot of farmers were forced into what's called the commercialization of agriculture. That means they had to stop growing essential food crops to feed their families and instead grow cash crops. But this didn't make the farmers rich. Those cash crops were shipped off to feed the booming industries back in Britain, which just left the Indian cultivators incredibly vulnerable to starvation.
All right, Section 3, Systematic Industrial Decline, the de-industrialization of India.
Now, the colonial government didn't just accidentally neglect Indian industry. They actively dismantled it, and they had a very calculated twofold motive for doing so. Number 1, they wanted to reduce India to a mere exporter of raw materials because, Britain's rapidly expanding factories desperately needed those materials. And number 2, they wanted to turn India into a massive, sprawling market to sell all the finished products pumping out of those British factories. The outcome was absolutely catastrophic. India's world-famous traditional handicraft industries just collapsed, and that created massive unemployment across the board. Now, to be fair, a few modern industries did slowly start to pop up later on. You had some cotton and jute mills, and eventually the Tata Iron and Steel Company, or TISCO, which started up in 1907. But this growth was agonizingly slow, and the crucial missing piece was that India had no capital goods industry, Basically, they didn't have the factories to build the machines that build other goods. Without that, it could never truly industrialize on their own.
Which brings us to Section 4, Foreign Trade and Wealth Drain, the Illusion of Progress.
If you look at the colonial ledgers from this chapter, they actually show India generating a large export surplus. Now on paper, that sounds like a good thing, right? Exporting more than you import usually means you're making money. But if India had this huge surplus, where exactly did all that wealth go? Well, we have to look at what was actually crossing the borders. India was systematically forced to extract and export primary products, things like raw silk, cotton, wool, sugar, indigo, and jute. And in exchange, they were forced to import finished consumer goods like clothes and light machinery that were produced in Britain. Britain held a complete monopoly over this entire flow of goods. So essential commodities like food and clothing were being shipped out of the country in massive quantities, which left the domestic markets in India shockingly bare.
And honestly, geography kind of acted as destiny here. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 was a massive, massive turning point. It created this direct, highly efficient waterway connecting the Mediterranean straight to the Red Sea. Suddenly, ships didn't have to make that long, dangerous trip all the way around the continent of Africa. It slashed transportation costs dramatically. But here's the catch. This incredible engineering marvel wasn't used to integrate India into some free, global market. Instead, it was used as a mechanism to completely tighten the monopoly. Britain restricted over half of India's foreign trade exclusively to itself. And remember that export surplus we just talked about? Usually, a surplus means gold and silver are flowing into your country, making it richer. But not for India. That surplus was entirely drained away. It was literally siphoned off to pay for the British colonial administration sitting in London, to fund wars the British government was fighting in other parts of the world, and to pay for various invisible imports. The wealth was just sucked right out of the economy.
Let's look at the final piece of the puzzle, Section 5, Demographics and Infrastructure, the human cost. When we look past the trade routes and the ledgers to the actual everyday people living through this chapter, the demographic data, especially from the 1881 census onwards, is just deeply shocking. The overall literacy level across the entire country was less than 16%. 16%! That points to a staggering lack of educational infrastructure, and it's even worse when you look at the gender divide. The female literacy rate was sitting at a dismal, almost negligible 7%.
Then you have the public health reality. For massive chunks of the population, public health facilities were either totally unavailable or just hopelessly inadequate. Water and airborne diseases were everywhere. Because of this, the infant mortality rate was absolutely horrific. It was about 218 infant deaths for every 1,000 live births. Just to put that into perspective and show you how extreme that is, the present-day infant mortality rate in India is roughly 28 per thousand.
And because of this harsh environment, the rampant disease, the lack of healthcare, the extensive poverty, life expectancy during this period was a mere 32 years. Think about that for a second. 32. Again, contrast that with today, where life expectancy in India is hovering around 70 years. That single number, 32 years, really cements the grim reality of just how hard and how short life was under colonial rule.
Now you might be wondering, but wait, didn't the British build the railways and the postal system? Isn't that progress? Well, we really need to deconstruct this illusion. Yes, the railways were introduced in 1850, but the real motive behind building them wasn't to empower the Indian people or provide public transport. It was strictly to subserve colonial interests. The roads they built were almost entirely designed to mobilize the British Army within the country and to drag raw materials out of the rural countryside to the nearest port or train station. There was actually a dangerous shortage of all-weather roads. That meant during the rainy season, rural areas were completely cut off. So when natural calamities or famines hit, millions of people were left highly vulnerable with no way to get relief. The infrastructure was built to exploit, not to elevate.
And that brings us to the end of our economic autopsy of this vital chapter in history. As we've seen, it's a story of deliberate agricultural stagnation, calculated de-industrialization, a massive drain of wealth, and a truly devastating human toll. The colonial economy left India functionally depleted. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to chew on. How does the legacy of these massive foundational economic challenges still echo in the structure of the modern Indian economy today? Because understanding this past, it's not just about memorizing history. It's the absolute key to understanding the monumental task of development that India had to take on starting on August 15, 1947. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.